Oh, okay. Our study is Are You a Natural? Genome over Home.
I'm Becky Halls. I'm Haley.
So our intro is we're going to introduce some famous identical twins. This is Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, actresses, and Tina and Tara Mowry, models and actresses, and Ronnie and Tiki Barber, famous football players. And so they're all identical twins. So identical twins share very similar physical characteristics, obviously, but what shapes their personalities? And this leads to the discussion of nature versus nurture, and to what extent does the environment shape a person, or to what extent is it their intrinsic self, such as their genetics? Identical twins have served the psychological community as an example as to how genetics and the environment shape the specific psychological traits. So nature versus nurture debate, and the definition is the debate about the relative contributions of biological processes and the experiential factors to development. This theory has become even more prevalent today with the rise of behavior genetics, which is the study of how genetics influences certain psychological traits. And today we are discussing the development of intelligence and personality. And this relates to our landmark study because the researchers of the study wanted to determine what factors contribute the most to a person's development. So is it the environment or is it their genetics? So our landmark study, Are You a Natural?, was conducted in 1990, and it utilized monozygotic twins that had either been reared apart or reared together. And so the importance of the difference between the twins being reared apart or reared together is if they're reared apart, they're in the same environment, so that kind of serves as a control. Whereas if they're reared apart, they have a different environment, so you can compare the test. Okay, that you can compare the test results of those that have been reared apart and whether or not the environment influences those. Monozygotic twins are from the same zygote, so they share identical genomes. Yeah. So the background leading up to this study was throughout the late 20th century, behaviorism was a dominant theory, and behaviorism says that environment is what completely shapes who a person is and their personality. And so the reason that this was such a prominent theory was that the inner mind was really difficult to measure and to see what was influencing it. The other thing is you can't just look at a person and know their genetic makeup and what kind of genes they possess and what those genes do specifically. And the technology at the time probably wasn't that well developed to do that, to even know that much about genes. And the idea that people lacked free will made a lot of people uncomfortable, so they would probably just rather assume that their environment was shaping who they were, which is something that they can control and manipulate rather than their own genes, which they can't. So the landmark study researchers were Thomas Buchard, David Lycan, and associates, and it was conducted through the University of Minnesota. So they wanted to better understand the extent to which genes influence certain psychological traits in the development of individuals. And so they also wanted a way to separate the environmental influence and the genetic influence because it's really hard to determine as a child grows up what is actually influencing their psychological development. And so that is why they used the monozygotic twins that were reared apart or reared together to separate those two variables. And so the research question that they were trying to answer is, to what extent does an individual's genetic makeup influence the development of psychological qualities? So the participants for this study were 56 pairs of monozygotic twins that had been reared apart, so they grew up in separate environments from the United States, and 7 other monozygotic reared apart twins from other countries. And so when the twins were put through the testing, they compared the results of those reared apart to those that had been reared together, so they grew up in the same environment. The materials and the procedure, the researchers basically had a week with the pairs of twins when they would come in, and they just put them through a bunch of questionnaires and testing, such as 4 personality trait scales, 2 intelligence tests, 3 aptitude and occupational interest inventories, inventory of household belongings, life history interviews, psychiatric interviews, and sexual history interviews. The variables and experimental controls. The dependent variable was just the individual answers that the twins gave. The controls were that all the twins took the same tests, and so this would rule out the possibility that they would give different answers to different test questions. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but that's why they did it. The twins were interviewed individually, so that one twin couldn't influence the results of another, which is also kind of self-explanatory, but it was necessary that they had separate testing measures. And the study used monozygotic twins, meaning that they had exactly the same genetic makeup, which was another control for the study, serving the purpose of same genetic makeup, so they would see what kind of results they would get.
So the psychological construct. So Boucard and Lycan were trying to measure an internal psychological traits, and they measured these traits by using questionnaires, and then they calculated a mathematical correlation. So an R value is a correlation of how similar, in this study, one twin was to the other identical twin. So R values can range from +1 to -1, and the closer the R value is to the +1 or -1, the more closely related the variables or the twins are. And the closer the R value is to 0, the less closely related the variables are. And then using the R values, they calculated the similarity value. And the similarity value is found by dividing the R value of the twins reared apart by the twins reared together. And the closer the value was to 1, the more genetics influence the trait. So the goals, one of the researchers' main goal was to determine a way to separate the influence of genetic and environmental factors on psychological traits. And in the research, it didn't really say whether the researchers had a prediction, but because they were trying to set out, they were however, because they were conducting this research in contrast to the previously popular theory of behaviorism, we kind of infer that they were open to the possibility of the psychological traits having a stronger genetic influence. And the results of their study prove this to be correct. The traits that they observed had a strong genetic linkage. So this is a graph of the R values of the selected psychological characteristics. So the light blue is the monozygotic reared apart twins, so the twins that had different environments growing up. And then the dark blue is the monozygotic reared together twins. So the closer the R values are to each other, the less of an effect an environment has on them. Because if both the reared apart and the reared together twins have basically the same R value, that means that even though their environments are different, they're still equally as similar. So one example is the California personality test, which is this one. You can see that the R values are very, very similar. So that just means that that trait is very genetically influenced. So the outcome of the traits examined, most variation between twins reared apart and those reared together was due to genetic variables. So the twins' R values were pretty much the same, even though they grew up in different environments. So that means that there wasn't very much environmental influences. And most similarity values were close to 1. And the lowest similarity value was 0.784, which is still a really high similarity value. So the researchers provided a way to test genetic and environmental influences, which was one of their goals. So why is this a landmark study? The researchers demonstrated that there are traits that are strongly genetically influenced, and some of these that they found were IQ, occupation, personality, and interest. And this study served as a model, as a way to separate the influence of both genetic and environmental factors on psychological traits. So the debate of nature versus nurture is an ongoing discussion in psychology and throughout all society. And these researchers, one of the first to actually provide scientific and quantifiable evidence that could be used to measure the development of psychological traits. And this study also demonstrated that the theory of behaviorism was not absolute, because a lot of the traits that they studied were very genetically influenced.
So there was obviously criticism of the case at the time, mainly circling around the equal environment assumption. So this assumption is that identical twins that were raised together were raised in the same environment and are treated the same. This isn't true though, because sometimes identical twins are still treated differently, even though they were reared together. They can grow up in different environments. So this invalidates this assumption, which then invalidates the study that the monozygotic twins were in the same environment. So a supporting case of the landmark study was an Italian twin study. This studied the effect of environmental and genetics of the environment and genetics on self-reported creative achievement in art and science. So they took 338 pairs of twins, 79 pairs of monozygotic twins, and 90 pairs of same-sex dizygotic twins. They averaged around 26 years old for each twin. They took one test, the Creative Achievement Questionnaire, to determine their artistic creative achievement and their scientific creative achievement. They used a scale ranging from 0 to 7, 0 being no talent or no training in a certain field, and 7 being either professionally published or critiqued. So they came up with a correlation between the scientific and artistic achievement being 70% due to genetics. They concluded that there was a pleiotropic effect, which means that one gene is influencing 2 or more seemingly unrelated phenotypes. So this came into effect when developing personality traits associated with creativity. They found out that 30% of the phenotype was due to the environment. This also relates to the behavior genetics theory we learned about in class. To remind you, the study theory is the study of the role of heredity in individual differences. These studies relate to this theory most directly as it looks at the heredity of personalities, which is an individual difference, which falls under the definition of behavior genetics. It also counteracts behaviorism. Okay, so to relate to well-being. In the first study, personality was found to have high genetic linkage. As an individual, learning more about your personality is an application to well-being. Strengths Quest is used by Augustana students to identify and reinforce the strengths of individuals in order to promote well-being and success. Many freshmen took this before they got to school this year. So, Strengths Quest says that strength begins with talent. A talent is a naturally recurring pattern of thought, feeling, or behavior that can be productively applied. Strengths are produced when talents are refined as knowledge and skill. And while each person defines success for himself or herself, achievement and excellence result from fully developing and applying strengths. So our activity is that you're going to separate into 3 groups, and we're going to assign your group a career. You're going to pick 5 strengths that play a role in that career, and you're going to pick one person to be your spokesperson. Tell us why you picked these strengths. So you're going to pick 5 strengths off of this list. So take the strengths that you applied to that career and think about your own career, and think about how you can use your own strengths to further your career. $14.27. I have a trophy because trophy markers. Dang.
No, you're lucky because you said
Yeah, we were like, they're both ripped apart.
Which is fine. I went, oh, no. And then
I was like,
paper, so
wait, root apart in the same environment.
I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. I messed up. Which I would think that.
Yeah. I know. I just have to I've never heard of this word, so I have to memorize that one. Oh God, it's still recording!